infinite complaisance, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Into the Fray. A few things to mention before we get to my chat with W.T. Watson covering Canadian monsters and mysteries. You can find everything Into the Fray by going to intothefrayradio.com, and you can follow me on the major social media platforms Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you have yet to catch it, On the Trail of UFOs Night Visitors is available on most video-on-demand platforms, including Amazon Prime. And On the Trail UFOs and On the Trail of UFOs Dark Sky are also available on those same platforms. Please make sure to leave a review when you're finished watching them. Also, Small Town Monsters American Werewolves has also released. Again, VOD platforms. Watch it, enjoy it, rate it. If you want to be a guest on Into the Fray, either for the main show or maybe for a patron-only episode, get in touch with me, Shannon at intothefrayradio.com. And speaking of Patreon, a couple of the latest episodes include Cattle Mutilations Part 1. This was a live video chat where we discussed everything moot-related. We were actually lucky enough to have Christopher O'Brien join us for a portion of this chat. Chris is a veteran researcher specific to the cattle mutilation phenomena and author of Stalking the Herd and its upcoming analysis book that is long awaited. So huge thanks to Chris for joining the patrons and I. Cattle Mute Part 2 is now available, featuring a live chat with an Arizona rancher currently experiencing mutilations and even more on his property. There are now 113 patron-only episodes available instantly, and this is at even just the $5 a month level. Higher pledge levels get you physical rewards like signed books, stickers, and even monthly one-on-one chats with moi. So, head over to patreon.com and search Into the Fray, or head to any of my socials and click on my Linktree link. New patrons over at patreon.com: Grant Gillespie, Race Hobbs of the Unex Network, Aaron Mendonca, Vinicius dos Santos, Molly Briggs, Amanjit Kaur, Brenna, Justin Miller, Vanessa Miller, Brad Ward, Heather Allen, Denise Ann Sigler, Rebecca Wertrich, Chris Frazier, Spencer Caliguri, Trudy Perry, and Eric Lewis. Welcome to the dark side. And my alpha level patrons. These are people helping to support Into the Fray at the $20 or more a month pledge level at patreon.com. Brad Ward, Mike Archer, Chris Guerrero, Patrick Ray, David Otto, Matthew Lacewell, Ted Cheever, Jake Dressel, Heather Stockwell, Steve Alarcon, Stephen Bashore, John, William Cornell II, Roy Daniel, Randy, Tyler DeMoney, Sticky Soundzine, Karina, Eric Ribbich, Josh Arthur, Christopher Fowler, Andrew of Black Triangle Coffee, Maynard W., Azriel, and Sean Kevin Jason. Thank you guys so much. I cannot tell you how much your continued support means to me, and that goes, of course, to all of my patrons. All right, and last but certainly not least, if you're looking for another great podcast to add into your rotation, let that search bar take you to Jim Harold's Campfire. The format, it's just like mine. He talks to everyday people who experience extraordinary things. The Campfire covers hauntings, UFOs, cryptids, and some of my personal favorites, the very hard to classify one-offs. The Campfire is in its 13th year, so you have plenty of shows to binge. Some of the latest encounters shared with Jim include the Phantom Bellhop, a future for seeing Ouija board, and more. So, do me a favor and follow Jim Harold's Campfire on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to Into the Fray. And now, without further ado, let's get to some Canadian monsters and mysteries, eh? Yeah, it was tough to pick, actually, just a few from your book, because there is such an eclectic collection of things in this book.
Yeah.
So yeah, on this edition, we are here to talk Canadian monsters and mysteries with W.T. Watson, and it was released just this month, and that was on the heels of his Mysteries in the Mist, Fog, and Clouds in the Paranormal, and you and I hopped on for a patron-only live video chat for that one, but then, of course, people can also catch you on another main ITF episode for Phantom Black Dogs. That was episode number 306. So we were talking just a moment ago, of course, literally moments ago, that this is just a tiny sampling of what you have curated for this book. And I mean, as far as that process goes, is it the same for each and every book, or you just kind of let the information flow where it's going to take you, or do you have some of the same sources that you try to pull from?
I mean, obviously there are sources that you go to for paranormal lore, particularly if you're researching a particular subject. If I want to know something about man-wolves, I go to Linda Godfrey. I mean, she's the it person for that particular topic. But one of the delights that I take in what I do is actually trying to locate maybe sources people haven't heard of, maybe books that people haven't heard of, or at the very least, texts that haven't been referred to in a while. I like to dig up some of the older stuff because we've got, paranormal writings going back for decades. And it seems a shame to me that more people aren't referencing that stuff, but instead keep going to the more modern, so-and-so who's a popular, person right now said such and such. So I really like to dig into places where maybe other people wouldn't look. And in the process, it is a little different for every book. Mysteries in the Mist, which we mentioned a minute ago, started with an idea. I went down a rabbit hole trying to see just how many, mist stories I could find in the paranormal. And obviously I found enough to fill the whole book, and probably could have done more than that. Canadian Monsters and Mysteries was a little bit different because we had a situation where there's one, topic that stands out in when you think about Canada. And it's, of course, Sasquatch. And there's so much Sasquatch lore in Canada that I chose not to cover that particular subject in this book. I'm actually it's going to have its own book, basically. The other thing is, there's so many haunting stories in Canada that, again, I think it's something that deserves a book of its own, and that I'll look at it. Important in the future. And finally, I chose not to do the Wendigo because Beyond the Fray has released a fantastic book on Wendigo lore, and I didn't think there was anything I could do to improve on that. So it was more a process of exclusion this time. And then I went to the various sources and started looking around, and I discovered that there's a real dearth of references to people in Canada or Canadian stories from U.S. authors. So some of the people that you'll see in the bibliography for this book are people that you may not have heard of before, because they're Canadian authors writing pretty much for a Canadian audience. I just thought it was fascinating that there's all these wonderful stories up here that a lot of people have never heard of.
Well, and I would imagine having to omit things on purpose is a very good problem to have.
Yeah, having the source material, available for probably another 2 or maybe more books is not a problem that I'm loath to have. I'm
Yeah.
quite happy to start digging into that subject now too.
Yeah, I'll be, as you know, I will be looking forward to the Extreme Max with the Northern Neighbors book. Can't wait for that one.
Yeah, we're going to go into some areas that people don't typically think of when they think of the Sasquatch phenomenon. I think that you'll find that Sasquatch is a thing here in Canada, all over Canada, not just in British Columbia.
Well, let's say that we dive in here, and in a lot of these stories, I'm not going to attempt to say some of the words that are embedded within these little stories here, and you could probably chuckle right off the bat because of the first one that I chose was the underwater moose, and I'm not going to say the native word that was given to it. I will let you do that if you so choose. But yeah, the first tale that I have chosen for the audience and for you to tell is the underwater moose.
So this particular story derives from one of those Canadian authors I was telling you about, a guy named John Worms. I honestly don't know if Mr. Worms is even still with us. I haven't been able to ascertain that, but he wrote a wonderful book called Strange Creatures Seldom Seen. And that book is a collection of cryptid stories from his native Manitoba, and it focuses on First Nations people. So a lot of the witnesses in these stories are actually people that have lived on this land for centuries. Now, as you said, there is a Cree word for this underwater moose character that we're going to talk about here. And I honestly wouldn't attempt to pronounce it because I haven't heard somebody who speaks that language say that word. So I really have no idea how it would be pronounced. But it looks something like Etamgapawuska or something along that line. It's very convoluted. But it means just what it says. It is the underwater moose, and the Cree actually have a word for this thing. There are a number of stories about the underwater moose, and most of them agree that this is a creature that's not like your regular moose. It tends to have shorter legs. It tends to have a sort of a sagging belly. Its antlers are branchier, is the way people describe it, than a regular moose. And most interestingly is underneath the snout of this thing, it has a flap. Worms theorized that it was kind of like a set of gills. And these creatures are supposed to actually live in bodies of water, not around them or close to them, but actually in them. And the best story that I found for that was, I don't have an exact date for this, but there was a family named Spence who were fishing commercially, basically, in a place called Mynarski Lake, which is north of Nelson House, Manitoba, if you want to look that up on a map. They're out doing their thing. They're fishing. They're doing what they do to make a living. They are low on meat for the season, and so they're looking for a moose or an elk or something to come along that they can bag to fill out their meat stores for the time that they're going to be there. They're out on the lake, and they hear a sound that one of the people described as like something gasping for air. And this animal appeared in the middle of the lake. Now, if you know moose and moose behavior, typically what you see with a moose that's swimming is that it goes into the water, on the shore, and it sort of paddles its way to wherever, or walks its way, depending on how deep the water is, to wherever it's going. This thing popped up in the middle of the lake rather than coming from the shore. It is an age-old fact that the person who doesn't have a handy gun or whatever has to make do with whatever they can to kill game animals. And in this case, and apparently this is fairly common up north, they determined that they were going to drown this moose and bag it for meat. They managed to get their lines over the horns of this creature without it poking a hole in the side of their aluminum boat. And they started dragging the thing, but they couldn't drown it. Normally it takes a minute or two for a moose to succumb. It took them quite a lot longer to get this creature to finally give over. When they finally, when it finally went limp and it was finally dead, they dragged it back to shore, and it took 13 people to haul this creature out of the water. Normally, you can get a moose, what I'm told, I've never done this, but you can get a moose out of the water with, 4 or 5 people, maybe 3 if you got strong folks. It took 13 people with 4 ropes to get this creature out of the water. And when they got it out of the water, they realized that they weren't looking at a normal moose. Worms actually includes some photos of this thing, and it does not look like the moose that you think of when you think of Canada, the big, long, spindly legs and the great rack of horns and all that fun stuff, right? This creature looked exactly like what I was describing earlier. It had much shorter legs, had a very saggy belly, and it had that flap underneath its snout that worms theorized was actually like a gill set, basically. They figured that it took them so long to actually kill this thing. What took them so long to actually kill this thing was that it was actually breathing water, and the only reason it succumbed was because they were moving faster than it could process water. So it finally did. Die. But the other thing that they noted, because of course these guys were all hungry, and they butchered this creature and set it as stored it for meat for the season that they were going to be there. The fat for this creature, moose fat apparently is usually very white. The fat for this creature was yellow with a sort of a purplish tinge, which gave them some pause. But they said, the meat was good. They ate the meat. They ate the moose. So there's no evidence left. Apparently, though, there was enough of it left that worms actually got some DNA work done for this thing. And the DNA specialist told him that it looked like DNA from like Eurasian moose species, and they theorized that maybe it was some kind of a hybrid or something. He didn't tell him it came from an underwater moose. But so there's stories from the native folks of people opening fire on one of these things to no effect. So on the one hand, you kind of wonder, well, is this actually a flesh and blood creature? But then you have this story where they haul this thing out and eat it. So this has to go in the category of, I don't know what the heck this is.
Well, yeah, and to actually drag that thing on shore and then be like, okay, it's got the flaps and the belly and the legs are shorter. And then instead of just being like, hey, maybe we need to call whatever closest scientist around, they're just like, we're hungry. It's going to get eaten right now.
Yep, pretty much. Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that the folks who live in it, one of the things about Canada that most people don't realize is that A, it's the second largest country in the world. B, it has the longest coastline in the world. C, it has literally tens of thousands of lakes that are over 3 square kilometers. The majority of the people in Canada, I forget what the exact number is, but something like 85 or 90% of the people in Canada live within 100 miles of the U.S. border. So you have these vast swaths of wilderness area that, are basically inhabited by, native people and a few intrepid others. So when you talk about, let's contact the nearest, university or whatever, the nearest university was probably over 1,000 kilometers away. It's you start to think of these distances when you live in Canada, and it's like, oh my goodness, yeah, it's like, I don't know if there'd been anything left of the thing by the time some university professor got up there anyway. So But yeah, it is a shame that somebody couldn't get there to examine that creature, because it would have been a really interesting biology paper, I'm sure.
That is for sure. Yeah, and I assume because you would have put it in here, but how many sightings did you come across? I mean, obviously there was enough that the native people, the Crees there, they named it and they were able to describe it. And then you have this Spence family who drug it ashore with the help of some other folks. What other sightings did you come across, if any?
Yeah, I don't recall the exact number of underwater moose sightings. I mean, there weren't nearly as many as there were for things like giant beavers, for instance, which is something else we're supposed to have up here. But I would say, if I remember correctly from the book, there were probably 4 or 5 good sightings in addition to this one, that people that have seen this thing. The funny thing about First Nations people, particularly up here, is that when they encounter something mysterious like an underwater moose or a giant beaver or something along that line, their elders tell them to just keep it to themselves. That was for them. So they're always struck with this tension between, I saw something really weird and I want to talk about it, and their elders telling them not to talk about it. So I was amazed that Worms managed to get as many witness accounts as he did from First Nations folks that he associated with.
Well, that was a unique one. I hadn't quite ever heard of the underwater moose before. Well,
most people have.
Yeah, well, that's why it's good to pick this book up, because there's all kinds of goodies in here that I know I've never heard of, and a lot of other people will not have heard of it either. So, well, next up, I chose the Owlman. Let's talk a little bit about this subject.
Yeah, so when you say the word Owlman, almost everybody who knows anything about Forteana instantly thinks of Cornwall in the UK, right? Because there was John Downes and the folks over there, documented sightings of this weird creature that appeared to some people. I don't remember the dates for that, but that's probably the most well-known set of Owlman sightings out there. But Canada's got you beat. The first Owlman sighting in Canada was in 1798. It happened in York, Ontario, which has now been absorbed by the city of Toronto. So the kind of idea, it's right in the populous area of Canada, and even in that day there were people living there. It's not part of the wilderness areas or any of that kind of thing. The chronicler for that time period actually noted that there was a church that was haunted by a man or a ghost that was capable of turning itself into a giant owl. And that's about all he said about it. He said there's just like a paragraph of text there. Yep, there's this church and there's this weird thing that turns into an owl if you don't get too close to it or whatever. If you fast forward to 1811, though, there was if it were UFOs, you'd call it a flap. There was a flap of Owlman sightings, and again in the same area of Ontario. The witnesses universally, there were over 100 sightings. The witnesses universally described a thin male figure with wings coming either from its back or replacing its arms. Now, the interesting thing about this critter is that it was most frequently seen after dark, of course, because the monster has to appear out of the dark to scare the bejeebies out of you, right? It was known to haunt graveyards, which is another classic paranormal thing. I think of my Phantom Black Dogs when I think of graveyards, or isolated forest land. So again, you had all of these farmers and salt of the earth people reporting seeing this weird thin male figure that had wings coming out of its back or out of its arms, or where it should have had arms. So there were a whole series of Owlman sightings in 1811. And then, to get really bizarre, the First Nations people in British Columbia in 1918, right at the end of World War I, reported something that they called Tataklea. And again, I've never heard anybody who spoke the language pronounce this, so I'm just guessing. but that word in their language translates to something like Owlman monster. And First Nations people reported this thing as these things. There were actually 5 of them. The writer that I recorded this from referred to them as 5 sister ogres who were taller than human beings and devoured anyone they could get their hands on, which kind of brings you back to First Nations stories about some of the creatures that people think were Sasquatch. You know, your Sasquatch stories amongst native people seem to be divided evenly between, oh, this is the guardian of the forest, and oh, this is the thing that steals our children and eats them, depending on the area and what tribe you're dealing with. This owl woman monster was apparently real enough to these native people that they actually hunted these things down and killed them. So they must have been solid enough to actually succumb to whatever it was they were hunting them with. Of course, the papers of the time, as was very common, dismissed this all as the superstitious ramblings of savages, quote unquote. Because of course, First Nations people weren't really recognized as people at that time. But whatever this was, whatever these were, they were scary enough to cause these folks to actually hunt them down and kill them. And they were real enough for that to happen, which kind of reminds you of some of the stories from up in Alaska, villages being abandoned because of other creatures that appeared and started preying on the people up there. So this whole Owlman thing is definitely still something that happens in Canada. I didn't find any recent sightings of Owlman type creatures, but it's certainly something in the history of Canada.
Well, and as you said, a lot of these things, of course, after dark, and they also do seem to choose to frequent graveyards, which is even common in Bigfoot sightings.
Yeah, and that's one of those weird things about whether you're talking Sasquatch or an Owlman, or when you start talking about the man wolf, you see the same thing associated with phantom black dogs, associated with graveyards, associated with burial cairns, associated with these other monuments to the dead. That kind of makes you wonder, what does death have to do with these sightings? What is it about these places that attracts these beings, whatever they may be? It does make you think about how there may be something weirder going on than just a giant furry hominid or some weird guy with wings that look like an owl's. I mean, that's pretty strange in itself.
Yeah, it is. That'd be pretty cool to see. I don't know about the whole 5 ogre sisters thing. That seems quite terrifying. That seems like something straight out of The Hobbit, right? Like when he's trying to battle them and they turn them into stone. It just reminds me of that story. But that might be on the no list. But just an owl man flying over and you're going, well, that's not a normal owl. That would be pretty cool to see.
Yeah, and then you have the whole Mike Cleland, owl connection with UFOs and his whole idea that these owls and other experiences may just simply be initiatic experiences that people are having.
Right.
Because we don't have rites of passage really in our society anymore. So maybe the intelligence that runs the universe has decided, hey, there's a certain subset of people that would really benefit from having these sightings, and it will open their mind's eye and something incredible happen for them. Who's to say?
And then they never go outdoors again.
Well, some of them, yeah.
Yeah. So the idea of phantom anything is quite interesting to a lot of people, including myself. You got phantom ships, phantom vehicles, and you cover in this phantom trains, and that's what I chose to cover in this episode because I love the idea of phantom trains. And one of the stories that you found takes quite the turn.
Yeah, well, they're all pretty interesting. I will, for all the nautical folks out there that are listening, mention that There are some good phantom ship stories in the book, too. Like I said, Canada has its good fair share of hauntings, and there's, I don't remember exactly how many phantom ship stories, but they're there if you're interested in that sort of thing. So with phantom trains, yeah, and as you said, we have phantom smoke clouds, we have all kinds of phantom, we have phantom black dogs here too. Maybe not as numerous as in the UK, but they're still here. Phantom trains is an interesting thing because 2 of the 3 stories that I included in the book are actually death portents. In other words, the sighting of the phantom train preceded death or catastrophe. In the first story that I talk about, 1908, this is in province of Alberta, if I remember right. Yes, Alberta. So there's 2 guys. They're on a train, Bob Toohey and Gus Day, and they're working the Lethbridge line, which is again a place in Alberta. They are doing as they normally do, riding the train, and the conductor, Bob Toohey, sights the headlight of a train on the same track coming straight at them. He realizes, given the distance, that he doesn't have time to clear the vehicle. He yells to his firemen to get off the train, Gus Day. He jumps off the train. As they watch, this train veers to the right. There is no track to the right of it, but it veers to the right and passes them, even though, again, like I said, there's no track. They can see that the coach windows in the train are lit, and they can even see passengers as this thing goes by them. Well, it scared the bejeebies out of Toohey. Gus Day doesn't seem to have been affected too badly, but Toohey actually called in sick from work the next day and the day after that. He was so frightened. And given what happens later, I have to wonder if he wasn't having a touch of precognition, or if there was a superstition amongst trained people that seeing a phantom was a sign of approaching death. I don't know, if that was the case or not, but he certainly seemed to be afraid that this was going to be his undoing. In fact, he was so afraid that he requested a transfer to another line. So he was replaced on the Lethbridge train by a guy named Bob Nicholson. And Gus Day actually stayed on as his fireman, the guy that was in the original sighting. So Bob Nicholson and Gus Day are on their train again. They're 3 kilometers outside of Medicine Hat, and the same thing happens to them. They see the oncoming light of a train, and the train seems to be coming right at them. The train goes around them. Even though there's no track for a train to go around them on, they see the lighted coach windows, the passenger. So of course, neither of them has any idea what to make of this. Things go along fairly normally for some time, but eventually what happens is that Toohey, who's piloting the Lethbridge train, and Nicholson, who's piloting Toohey, who's piloting the Spokane Flyer, and then Nicholson, who's piloting the Lethbridge train, are actually involved in a head-on train collision outside of Medicine Hat, Alberta, that is forceful enough that people actually heard this all throughout the town of Medicine Hat. Toohey and I believe Day and Nicholson and several other crew members were all killed in the crash. So this phantom train seems to have been some kind of a death portent, something that, some kind of a psychic experience that warned these people that the train was coming for them. It's gone down now in the annals of psychical research history, as one of those instances of people getting a sign before they actually died. Did you want me to go on to the next ones, or do you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, just really quickly, when I read that they could see the passengers inside, that really gave me chills. Yeah,
it's a very, very creepy story. It's one of those ones. It's like everybody thinks, oh, ghost stories, ooh, and they think of haunted houses and dark Gothic mansions and all that stuff. But I think some of this stuff is every bit as creepy as those haunted houses and so forth. This next story is a great example of that, the Phantom Train of Cape Breton Island. For those of you who don't know, Cape Breton Island is actually the northeasternmost section of the small, basically island province of Nova Scotia, which was settled mostly by Scottish settlers, thus the name. So near a town called Barraquois, or Barraquois, maybe. I'm not sure exactly how that's pronounced. The people on Cape Breton, the people of this town, every night for a month, people who lived on a certain hill would see a train around 7 o'clock each night. Now, there was no scheduled train, but they would see this train every night around the same time. Again, the train would proceed along. The coaches were lighted, but in this case, no people were seen. The really eerie thing about this is twofold. One is nobody ever heard a sound from this train. The second is that people on the hill who went down to the tracks to get a closer view of this train couldn't see it. But the people who were back up on the hill still could. So that's very interesting. So this thing would show up, it would do its run on the tracks, and then it would disappear. Again, folks who went down to try and get a closer look at it couldn't get a closer look at it. It wasn't visible to them from up close. The interesting thing is that this train pulled up to a particular gate each time before it vanished. And about a month after this started occurring, a man was killed at that gate where the train had been stopping all that time. And after that, the train was never seen again. So it's, it's like the train was coming for one passenger, and once it got that passenger, it was done. And I thought that was an extremely creepy story.
Yeah, not good to have your name on that train's ticket.
Nope. Don't want to take that train anywhere. And so the third Phantom Train story is not a death portent. It's called the Phantom Train of Wellington. Wellington is a town in Prince Edward Island, which is an even smaller province of Canada. Now, this one's an ongoing apparition. So it's continued to appear on and off throughout, since 1885. In December of 1885, a group of about 40 villagers had gathered to celebrate a wedding. And then, oddly enough, they decided that they were going to mourn the passing of a young man who had died. So I thought that was a little peculiar dichotomy there. Oh, let's have a wedding and then a funeral. I guess maybe, just getting people together for these kinds of events, since this was back in the day before cars and all that sort of thing, they just, they decided that they were going to do all their things at the same time. In any event, the people were gathered, they were doing this celebration. They saw a train actually pull up to the station, take on passengers, which is, again, creepy, and then vanish. And this train has been reappearing periodically, mostly in December evenings, for an extended period of time now. In fact, the writer that I looked at, I think it might have been John Colombo, actually notes that there's some modern accounts of people actually seeing this train. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the train appears in December. Now, everybody thinks of December as like, ho, 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 happy holidays, all this kind of stuff. But, if you go to some of the more Victorian, European, English traditions, December was a time of ghost stories and such. And if you look even farther back into some of the pagan traditions, that period between Samhain, which was at the end of October, early November, and the winter solstice was said to be a time when the dead walk the earth. And thus, there was this habit of people gathering around fireplaces and telling ghost stories and such late at night. So this thing appears in December, which is that time when dead are said to be most active. I thought that was just an interesting little aside, particularly since PEI again is one of those places that's heavily settled by European people, Northern European people from the Celtic lands and so forth. So just an interesting little aside.
Well, and also the phantom ships, which I also love, by the way. It's hard to choose between the ships and the trains, but the phantom ships, the trains, vehicles, anything like this, they do follow a pattern more that we would put them into a box of something residual, right? For the most part. But then that comes out of that residual box because of the fact that some of those who interact, essentially, that see them, eventually die. So then can we still leave them in that residual haunting box? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Again, I think that there is something to that idea of residual hauntings, or what some people call the stone tape theory, or that kind of thing. There certainly seem to be experiences that people have which seem almost like recordings that have been made that are played back under certain circumstances. Now, the trick here is, what is the circumstance that causes the playback of this thing? Does the individual have a certain psychic talent that maybe they're not aware of? Is this somebody who's about to die? As you approach the end, there are some that say, mediums and so forth, who say that you become more open to the other world. Maybe that's true. We just don't know. Or is something even stranger going on? And this is just the way that it appears to our perception, because we don't know quite how to process it otherwise. I find it interesting that, you have these phantom trains over here in the New World, and this whole business of the train driving around and, collecting people's souls and that sort of thing kind of reminds me of the Wild Hunt in Europe. So, which is a very active spiritual thing that happens. So, everybody says, oh, well, I have the answer to this. And they really don't. They really don't.
No, you have to run from people that say they have answers to the things that we talk about. Yeah, I find that really...
Absolutely.
What is really the point of the person seeing the train? If, in fact, it is a portent of death, and then, well, there you go. So why do they get a heads up? And also, do they get a heads up so that they can then get their affairs in order and say their final goodbyes to people? I mean, who would even think that would be what it was? I mean, I can't blame Bob or Gus or any of these other folks in these stories that you were just telling for not knowing exactly what to do with this information and in this sighting, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not like, some spirit appears to you and says, you have 3 days to live or whatever, and you try to get your stuff together. You get this weird phantom train thing that happens. You're like, well, what the hell does that mean? And then you have like the phantom train in Wellington, which doesn't seem to apply to a particular person, but you wonder if the train isn't stopping every December to, pick up some folks that, pass over the season, and now, it's time for them to go wherever it is they're going to go. That's as good an explanation as any, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can theorize all you want to, and you can pontificate all you want to, but in the end, the reason that we do this stuff is because it is a mystery, and we enjoy not knowing, I think. You can't speak absolutely about this stuff.
It would just be really nice if one of those passengers, if it was slowed down enough and one of those passengers could write in maybe, their dirty window, you have 3 days, some kind of a hint to these things.
Yes.
But no, they couldn't help old Bob or Gus out. But
yeah, it's like, hey, look, there's a train. Oh,
yeah. Yeah. Near miss to the tracks that didn't exist. I really like that. So
Yes.
our final offering for this episode is super weird, and it's why I had to have you cover this. And it is the Mississauga Blob. I did try to go for that one. Don't know if that's right, but this one is extremely strange, and that's saying a lot considering the things that we've already talked about. But this one is very unique.
Yes, this whole book is strange. I will freely admit that it's strange. I had way too much fun digging through Weird Fortiana and finding, bizarre things like fire spooks and stuff like that while I was in the process of writing the book. But this one was really bizarre. So it's June 1967. It's Mississauga, Ontario. Young lady, if I recall, she was 19 years old at the time this happened, heard a sound in the backyard of her house. And she goes out and she sees what she describes as a cylindrical column of flame shooting up from a green molten mass that is sitting underneath a picnic table in their backyard. They don't tell us what happened at the picnic table, but I'm assuming that it was scrapped by the time this was done. So this young lady's name was Donna Machette, I think, or I'm gonna take a guess at the pronunciation of my last name. So Donna grabs a the hose from the house and starts, spraying water on this fire. Her father Traven comes out and sees this thing. He described the flames as like a blowtorch up through the picnic table. So whatever it was burning really, really well. Fortunately for Donna, water actually put this substance out, whatever it was. And they ended up being left with about 4 ounces of this green, pockmarked, fibrous material that they had no freaking idea what this was. It was just weird. It just, it fell from the sky and it burned their picnic table up. So, of course, they're like, whoa, we need answers. What the heck is this thing? Where did it come from? So Traven later goes on to say, what baffles me is that on a Saturday in June, if a spaceship landed with little green men, or loaded with little green men, landed in my backyard, no one could have investigated it till Monday. Because he tried calling the local Canadian Armed Forces base. He tried calling the Toronto airport. He was apparently a very determined guy. He also called the University of Toronto and the Ontario Science Centre, none of whom on a Saturday could give him the time of day. There was nobody available to go out and look at this thing and tell him what it was or research it at all. One of the operators for one of the places that he called suggested that he contact the press, probably just to get him off their back. But so he does. He calls the press, and this story, and this Mississauga Blob story, this is what they called it, was the Mississauga Blob story, ends up being on the front page of the Toronto Sun the next day. Well, that got the attention of the local authorities. So on Monday, the Ontario Ministry of the Environment and the Peel Regional Police both came and took samples of this thing. And so the mystery deepens, because the material was identified as a mix of polypropylene and polystyrene, which are both plastics and both of which burn quite vigorously. But nobody could hazard a guess as to how the thing came to be in their backyard, why it had apparently fallen from the sky, what had ignited it and caused it to burn so vigorously that it, again, burned a hole in the middle of their picnic table. They could identify the material, but there was no explaining how it got there. It seemed to have literally fallen from the sky. And once that story was out in the Toronto Sun, 2 other families, one of whom was like a mile away from the Machettes, and then another who lived in Brampton, Ontario, which is not too far from there, reported finding similar things in their backyards. And again, nobody has any idea where this stuff came from, how it got there, why it was burning, anything. All they would say, well, it's plastic. So the authorities were stumped. And, as I said, Traven Machette was not impressed with their handling of it. I make a kind of a jibe in the book. because he's talking about how, if a spaceship loaded with little green men landed in his backyard, nobody would investigate till Monday. That's not entirely true. I worked with the volunteer fire service when I was younger, and we had a going joke that if the dispatchers didn't know what else to do, they dispatched the fire department, right? So if the aliens landed in the parking lot of our local high school, we would have gotten toned out to go and be the first contact of humanity with, whatever species came bebopping out of that flying saucer. So this is one of those fun Fortean stories, like frogs falling from the sky or fish or whatever that you just have. It's like, where did this come from? Why this particular mix of plastic? What caused it to ignite? Or was it ignited when it fell from whatever it fell from? It's just a weird story. It's a fun, weird story, and I had to include it because it was just too much fun to ignore.
Yeah, so did I, because that one has just so many questions and so much random in there. I was like, oh, that one is definitely going to be included in there. Well, let everybody know, please, not only where to find, of course, the newly released book that we just discussed, Canadian Monsters and Mysteries, but all of your works and where to find you online.
Well, of course, all of my nonfiction work is published by Beyond the Fray, and it's available on Amazon. If you have Kindle Unlimited, it's available through Kindle Unlimited, but it's also available as an ebook and as a paperback, both in the United States and in Canada. As far as where to find me online, just about anywhere. I have a W.T. Watson author page on Facebook. I'm on Twitter as at WT Watson2, if I remember correctly. And then I'm on Instagram as Curunir, Curunir 60, with the @ thing in front. I tell people, I'm always happy to hear from folks who've read the books and what you think about the books. And if you have strange stories you'd like to share with me, I've had a couple of people approach me about Phantom Black Dog sightings since I wrote that book. I'd be happy to hear from people, and I love to interact with my readers if they want to interact with me.
Well, I cannot wait to have you back on for Sasquatch in Canada talk.
Yeah, the tentative title of the book is Beyond BC. I started doing some research. Well, as I mentioned, when I started doing, or maybe I didn't, when I started doing the research for this book, I had to exclude some things because there was just so much material that if I had included that, I would have ended up writing the Encyclopedia Britannica instead of, a readable book. And one of those things was Sasquatch. One of the things that I wanted to do when I started looking at Sasquatch stories in Canada was seeing if, everybody, if I say Sasquatch in Canada, most people will come back and say British Columbia. And what I'm discovering as I dig into the research for this is that there are lots and lots and lots of Canadian Sasquatch stories, but we don't really hear about them because the folks that write the majority of Sasquatch, Bigfoot type books are, based in the U.S. And Lauren Coleman mentions, Yellow Top, which is a famous Sasquatch sighting here in Ontario. And a couple of other people mention a couple of sightings. There's one at Bighorn Dam in Manitoba, I believe. A couple of other things, but just those sightings, and you keep seeing those over and over in various Sasquatch books. And I was like, but there are literally hundreds of Sasquatch sightings in Canada outside of BC. So the tentative title of the book is going to be Beyond BC, Sasquatch in maybe Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario. I may throw in some stuff from Saskatchewan, and I've got some stories from Nova Scotia too. So, but it's going to focus probably in those three provinces because there's so much material there. I'm looking forward to going on tour for that one because I'm sure that I'm going to get some really interesting questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Whatever you can find in relation to Sasquatch up there, everybody's going to eat that right up.
Well, I figure as much.
Well, again, thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to our next talk.
I look forward to it as well. Thank you so much, Shannon.